Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the College of Architecture's Hyde Lecture Series. I'm Catherine de Almeida. I'm an assistant professor of landscape architecture here at UNL. And I'm incredibly excited to introduce our Hyde speaker this afternoon, Bill Rankin. Bill Rankin is an assistant professor of history in the Department of History at Yale University. He is a historian and cartographer and the creator of radicalcartography.net. If you haven't seen this website and if you're interested in mapping, everyone should go check it out. His prize-winning first book, After the Map, Cartography, Navigation, and the Transformation of Territory in the 20th Century, published by University of Chicago Press in 2016, is a history of the mapping sciences in the 20th century. His award-winning maps have been widely published, from design journals and mapping anthologies to the Best American Infographics series and National Geographic. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Bill Rankin.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Sarah, as well. Thank you, Dean Ackerman, for making this all possible. Thank you all for coming. So it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to giving the talk, looking forward to your discussion afterwards. As Kathy mentioned, I kind of wear two hats in the world. One hat is as a historian. I'm a historian of science and technology. I work on the history of the geographic and environmental sciences. As she said, I just published a book, kind of a prehistory of GPS, the relationship between new forms of mapping and the history of territory. Mike, is it not on? It's not on. How do I turn it on? On. Is it on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Is that better? Great. But I'm not going to primarily talk about that work today. Alongside my work as a historian, I've also spent the last 15 years or so making my own maps. Again, as Kathy mentioned, for my website, radicalcartography.net. And these maps have appeared in all sorts of places. Now I'm going to focus my talk on this mapping work, what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and how it relates to some of the questions I've asked in my own historical work. In particular, I'm going to talk mostly about two mapping projects. One is a series of maps of race and ethnicity in New York City, and the other is about conservation and demographics in Phoenix. Now, the premise of both of these projects, and really all of my mapping work and my scholarship, is that one of the primary ways we know about and make sense of the world is through maps. Maps don't just tell us where we are and how to get from A to B. They also tell us what exists, what's worth knowing about, even where we belong, who we are, what's like us, what's not like us. So the basic idea of my work is that if we're able to redesign and rethink the map, then we're very directly reimagining the world. Now, this should not come as a shock to those interested in design, but rather than just seeing maps as a way of projecting the world onto paper, I also see maps as a way of projecting our social, cultural, and political ideas out into the world. And this is where the title of this talk comes from. I think by mapping in a different way, we can end up switching our sense of what's visible and what's invisible. We can use maps not just to represent the physical, visible world, but also to make previously invisible landscapes visible, even primary. Now, before I walk through the two projects, though, I want to give some kind of background to what's motivating them and how they fit into a broader history and theories of cartography. So the main thing I want to talk about is what's called the base map. The idea of a base map is very simple, but quite powerful. The idea is just that if you want to make a map of something like geology, or population, or archaeological sites, you first start with a seemingly neutral topographic map, something like this. So this is just the contiguous United States from the US National Atlas of 1970. And once you have this base map, then you can layer over on top of it whatever else, whatever other information you care about. So you can layer over stuff about geology. This is the geological map. Here is another one of soils. Here's one of the historical location of American Indian tribes, and so on and so forth. Now, this all seems very straightforward. But I want to kind of walk through the process and show why it's so powerful. The most important part of the base map idea is that it's seen as a linear sequential process of the base map coming first, and then these thematic maps coming later. In this atlas, for example, which is kind of a big hulking thing, The narrative of the atlas itself begins with a series of these base maps for the entire country in the various regions, and then only later in the atlas come these thematic pages. Historically, the idea of a base map is also seen as strongly sequential. The term itself originated in the United States. It was first used to describe the mapping work of the US Geological Survey in the 1880s. Unlike in other countries where topographic mapping was done by the military, in the US it was done by this new geological agency. And they said when asking for funding that they first needed to make these base maps, the topographical maps, and then they could produce the geological maps that were actually part of their real work. And this was a very powerful way of getting the funding they needed for a rather extensive mapping program. Now, in reality, the process is never this straightforward and this linear. So, for example, in order to turn a base map into a thematic map, you often have to remove features first, such as the cities and highways and that kind of stuff you saw in the first one. And also with the actual surveying, often the topographic mapping was done at the same time or even later than the geological mapping. But in many cases, there's still very much a practical technological commitment to this idea of a base plus layers. Since a multicolored map like these would be made by using different printing plates, physical plates with different colors on them, and some of the plates, like the blue or the black plate, would be base map plates used for lots of different maps, while others, like red and green, would be switched out to make special plates only for specific series. And in the 20th century, there's really a huge investment in this kind of basic diagram about how mapping should work. So here, for example, is a sheet from what's known as the International Map of the World. This project was first proposed in 1891 by a German geographer. It lasted for most of the 20th century, only being discontinued in the 1980s. The idea was to make a uniform atlas of the entire world with all maps at the same scale using the same graphic standards. Before World War I, nearly every country in the world was officially part of this project. The graphic standards were committed to international treaties. And the goal, especially starting in the 1930s, was essentially to make a base map for the entire world. And then this map could then be used as a starting point for other mapping projects. So you could use it for making aeronautical charts, geological maps, statistical maps, and so forth. So you would just remove the elevation shading from this kind of map, and you'd end up with something like this. Instead, this is a map of an aeronautical map for piloting your plane near London. Now again, this ideal didn't really play out as planned, but along the way, thousands of these maps were made all around the world. And even for the projects that didn't succeed, the distinction between a base and the overlay was quite important conceptually. Even decades later, today, with GIS, we no longer have to worry about these physical printing plates, but it's still very common to see data online divided into so-called base layers that are presumably for any project, and the thematic layers, which are only to be used by specialists. So let's consider what this does conceptually. Taking a look again at this map of New York, this is basically saying that everything shown here is somehow neutral information that's relevant to almost any set of questions we might have. So if we zoom in, we see that neutral information consists of water and land, topography, roads, cities, political boundaries, and basic land cover like swamps and glaciers and stuff like that. But when we think about it, this kind of information really isn't neutral at all. This is mostly the information you need for planning major engineering works or military operations. And indeed, the main producers of the international map of the world after World War II were the US and British militaries. So what might seem like an innocent reporting of basic geographic features is actually a very partial view of the world that can only be really used for specific purposes. In particular, it's saying that physical, permanent things are more important and basic than temporary phenomena, more important than social phenomena. So information about health, demographics, conflict, inequality, law, air quality, pollution, and so on, these are supposed to be seen as supplemental rather than primary. And this, I think, is why it's so powerful. Now, as a map maker interested in revealing the complexity of the world, I think that this gets it exactly wrong. The things that really matter to me and matter to social and environmental policy and design are exactly these temporary and non-physical landscapes. So a lot of my work is about trying to make this kind of inversion, right? What happens when we throw out the idea of a base with layers on top, And instead, we see these invisible landscapes become both our starting point and our ending point. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to address this idea of a base map or question the neutrality of topographic mapping. Historians and theorists have been making some of these arguments for almost 30 years. And my own historical work is part of this long-standing conversation. But I think there's been less thought about what it would actually mean to make maps in a new way, to make maps that kind of live up to our theorization. So before I go into the two projects in depth, I want to show just a few very quick bite-sized maps that I've made that show how simple and yet analytically effective it can be to discard this idea of the base map. So these are not conceptually sophisticated projects, but they're kind of pointing us in the right direction. So for example, here's a map I made a long time ago that shows only the land in the United States managed by the federal government. The different shades of green here correspond to different agencies, so the national parks, the Forest Service, and so on. And so this map very clearly shows the huge contrast between the western and eastern parts of the country and the oversized importance of government management in Alaska. But if we'd had this over a kind of neutral topographic base, a lot of this pattern would be obscured because there's a greater density of kind of background stuff happening in the east, which would have kind of counterbalanced visually the map and made this main graphic move harder to see. Here's another one. This just shows the North American rail network, the colors corresponding to ownership by different companies. And here the big point was to try to see the integration of the rail systems of Mexico, US, and Canada, especially since the NAFTA free trade agreement in the 90s. If we had the background of the kind of the main political shapes, it'd be less easy to see the infiltration of Canadian rail companies into the United States and American rail companies into Mexico. Two other quick examples. Here's a map just showing world shipping routes. I think it's quite striking how we don't need to see coastlines or country boundaries at all. All we need is the data. Or inverting this, here's a map of agricultural land in the year 2000. Brighter colors here show land that's more intensely devoted to agriculture. And you see something similar, right? You see continuities across national boundaries. It's quite striking how recognizable the shapes of the continents are, minus these big holes for deserts, tundra, and rainforests. So these are kind of simple examples of the kinds of things I have in mind. These are easy, they're fun to make, they're visually compelling, and I like how they foreground the data rather than the coastlines. But at a slightly more conceptual level, I also think they make a nice visual argument that with things like shipping or agriculture, we're not dealing with a kind of neutral, pre-existing empty space that is then filled with activity. Rather, the spread of agriculture or railroads or shipping is actually about creating new space. So there are only two visual items here. There's the white space and the data is itself the landscape. If I had included even just coastlines, there would instead be three things going on. There would be the land and the water to begin with, the empty, neutral space, and then the data would be projected into this existing structure. And I think that, to me, brings in too much conceptual baggage. So with this as prologue, let me now talk about the two projects in some detail. So the first is a series of 5 maps of race and ethnicity in greater New York City. Here the maps are lined up in a row, and I'm definitely going to zoom in to show you what's going on. From left to right, we have maps showing African American, Asian, Hispanic, and the white population. And then the last map shows areas with a mix of races. So I originally made these maps for an exhibition on the psychogeography of New York City at the Pratt Institute of Design. So here are the 5 maps printed out, pinned on the wall. They're each kind of like 2 feet square. Since this show, the maps have shown up a few other places as well. They've actually been published twice in separate journals in Sweden, which is lovely, but I have no idea why, since I can't speak Swedish. Now, I'm starting with this project mostly because the maps here are quite simple. I've just taken data from the US Census for every block in greater New York and shaded each block based on the racial self-identification of the people who live there. So here's a detail of the Bronx. You can see the scale just goes from 0 to 100% for people who identify as Spanish, Hispanic, Latino, or Latina. Here is part of Brooklyn showing the black population. Here's Chinatown in Manhattan. Here's that same area showing white population. And finally, here's the map of diversity. You can see I just did a very simple mathematical calculation for how likely it is for two people on the same block to be of different races or ethnicities. This is called the index of diversity. It's a very standard measure in demography. So for all 5 maps, I'm showing only the data, only the social landscape of race and ethnicity, and the rest of the world, water, parks, streets, and so forth, remain blank. Now, obviously, these maps do not require any virtuosic mastery of GIS or hundreds of lines of handwritten code. And so my focus here is really on less on the details of production and more on trying to understand the effects of these maps, both analytic and emotional. What do we get from these kinds of simple graphics? Now, there are a couple of things that separate these maps from more common demographic maps. The first is that I'm not basing any of this on political boundaries. This jumps out immediately if you compare these maps to something like this. This plots the white population of New York, but New York City proper. So you can see there's a very simple base map here. It's the gray background with the purple highways. And this tells us where we are, what's worth paying attention to. And then the statistics are added on top of that very simple base. And the second big difference is that I'm plotting the data kind of block by block, which contrasts quite a lot with something like this that uses these much larger areas and has just 4 all or nothing data categories that show which group is in the majority, and areas where there's not a majority are basically left blank, the kind of light cream color. But I think the most important difference between my maps and these is that I've designed my maps to sit kind of somewhat strategically just at the edge of geographic legibility. So for a map like this, everything is clear to the point of seeming banal, straightforward. We're presented with a very familiar geography with the usual borders between city and suburb, between large population areas. Basically, this is just giving us a little more information about a New York City that we feel like we already know. It's not really reimagining the city at all. But with this map here, this is definitely the most recognizable of the 5, you still have to study a little bit to orient yourself. You have to find Central Park in the middle, that little rectangle there. You have to find the Hudson River, Long Island. It's not immediately clear what these kind of big white clouds or holes are. The other maps, like this one, this is African Americans, it's actually quite difficult to find Central Park or other familiar landmarks. And with the others, it's even harder. Now, all the maps are, in the end, ultimately legible. You can, in fact, find Central Park and the rivers and all of them, even if only very faintly. But you really can't get these maps at a glance. You don't see a familiar background shape then filled with data. And the effect, I think, of studying something like this map of African American areas is that you realize you're not just finding out where Black New Yorkers live. Instead, you're looking at a very different city than the one you might recognize, even if you yourself are a Black New Yorker. In particular, you see with these non-white maps a real decentering away from central Manhattan. So you're not greeted with the outline of the island and the major rivers. Instead, you see Newark, New Jersey over here. You see the big neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Queens, and the Bronx, and these little sort of satellite towns floating in the white space. So one possible analogy here might be something like Guy Debord's situationist map of Paris from 1957. He's taken the familiar map of Paris, cut it up into these little discrete chunks, and then rearranged them and connected them with these red arrows that are supposed to show motion, desire, what he calls dérive. The title of the map here is The Discourse on the Passions of Love. So Debord is not showing us paths through the familiar city. He's saying that by wandering through the city in your own particular way, you're actually rearranging the map and making a new city. Now, one thing I want to also emphasize with this project is the importance of having 5 separate maps instead of just one. At one point when I was giving a talk about these maps, the person making the promotional poster decided to overlay all 5 maps on top of each other. This is what they came up with. And this was actually quite great for me to see because I never would have done this on my own. And it made me realize just how important it was to have a series of separate maps instead of just one. So this map here shows one city that's comprised of a patchwork of different racial and ethnic areas. So you look at this map, you see New York, you see that it's got some pretty dramatic segregation. And the map as a whole basically becomes a map about segregation. But when you have 5 maps, rather than one city divided into its component parts, I think you end up with 5 different cities, each with their own centers and nodes and logics of continuity. And instead of being narrowly about segregation, I think these 5 maps together make a stronger statement about visibility and invisibility across racial lines, about the social logic of the city that's familiar to you, and the unfamiliar, even frightening void. And it emphasizes the basic high-level categories through which we understand race in the United States. Or even more specifically, having this last map, the 5th map of diversity, is itself an argument that diverse neighborhoods are a kind of distinct social form. With this map I showed before, for example, diverse areas where no group has a majority are shown with this very light cream color. They appear empty, unclaimed, they're described only negatively as places where no group has a controlling presence. But looking at this map here, we see that these neighborhoods are not just minor transition zones. They instead offer a competing narrative about segregation and multi-ethnic urbanism. This is a positive definition rather than a negative one, and it suggests a way of living in the city that isn't just about racial solidarity or exclusion. In some sense, the map is arguing for diversity as its own category of spatial identity. Now again, I think that we get all of this just from some very simple, basic graphic moves. We get this by doing much less graphically rather than more. So I'm only showing one thing at a time. I'm seeing it as an unfamiliar landscape unto itself, rather than only in relationship to a familiar base map geography of coastlines and political boundaries. So now let's turn to the maps of Phoenix. They made 3 different maps. They're all big wall maps. They're all the same size. And most of the information on each of the maps is the same. The only difference between them is the bright colors on this map show census data about race and ethnicity. This one, they show income distribution. And this one shows data on age. I originally did this project as part of an artist research visit to Arizona State University. Like the New York maps, they've traveled around since then. Here they are in an exhibition about drawing in Rugby, England. You can see that they're much larger than the New York maps. They're about 3 feet by 5 feet. They also show a much larger area. The New York maps showed an area about 18 miles square. These are showing an area about 75 by 125 miles, basically all of central Arizona. Now, the other thing to notice about these maps, of course, is that they show a lot more data. This is a very different strategy from the one of just isolating a single layer and showing it completely on its own. With these maps, I'm instead trying to talk about the interaction between the human and the natural landscape. And I'm interested in finding a way to show this relationship not as a stark divide, with the human world layered on top of the natural world and conceptually separate from it, but really as a hybrid landscape where it's difficult to say where the human ends and the so-called natural begins. And the specific issue that I'm interested in Phoenix is the confrontation between the city and the desert. Phoenix, as you know, is a very big city, 4 million people, surrounded on all sides by this enormous desert. And the negotiation between the city and the desert is a really important issue, one that engages questions of urban sprawl, conservation, land and water management, indigenous rights, and so on. Now, the way that this city-desert confrontation is usually presented, both in everyday language and on not a lot of maps, is to see the desert as a kind of empty tabula rasa into which the city is expanding. So we get this very clearly with something like Google Maps, has these huge blank areas where nothing is going on. We also get it with satellite maps like this one that make a strong visual argument about this stark city-desert dichotomy. We get it with this little series of maps I found just on the web that shows the city in orange and agriculture in green, kind of expanding into this neutral gray topographic nothingness. And this city-desert dichotomy is reinforced regardless of one's own political orientation. So you can see this empty desert either as a fragile ecosystem in need of protecting, or you can see it as a landscape rich in resources and primed for development. In both cases, the key question is about this line between city and desert. And this tabula rasa condition is something that's actually almost unique to Phoenix. Phoenix is one of the few cities in the US or anywhere else where there are very few political or topographic barriers to urban growth, and there's very little tradition here of prior settlement, for example, by Spanish colonists or small farmers. So cartographically, my starting point was to think as broadly as I could about the question of boundaries and how boundaries are shown on maps, in order to see if this city-desert confrontation is really the most helpful way of understanding what's going on. And the big move is to see this city-desert divide as just one among many boundaries. My main argument is that there are a lot of internal boundaries that exist both within the desert and within the city. And these are perhaps more relevant politically than the more obvious edge between city and desert. In particular, I want to show that the desert is not, in fact, empty, but is already quite full, especially in a legal sense, hence the title of the maps, the tabula repleta. And likewise, the city is not a single, unified, homogeneous entity. And this is what I mean by the subtitle. This is a patchwork of people and rights. So let me just walk through the map, explain what we're looking at. So the starting point here, it's a little bit washed out, but is the base map. This is the base map here. It's basically what you'd expect, just topography and streets. So you can see the mountains in the upper right and kind of scattered throughout, and there's a faint gray blob in the middle that's the street grid for Phoenix. Then the next step is to add the US survey grid. The big squares here are 6 miles across. The smaller squares are a mile across. I'm sure, as you all know very well, this grid structures the layout of most of the streets and farms in the United States west of the Appalachian Mountains. I don't even have to show you this slide, but there it is, just in case. The grid was designed in the late 18th century, mostly as a way for the federal government to promote easy and efficient sales of federal land. So I treat this grid as the kind of basic legal landscape. This is one designed to promote privatization and development. But for the last 100 years or so, there's also been a very strong move to keep a lot of this land under permanent government management, or to keep areas under the control of American Indian tribes, or to set aside areas for permanent conservation. So if we start with the grid, which is all land that can be bought and sold and developed, we carve out those areas that have been decommodified. This is the land that's managed for economic purposes, like mining or agriculture, but that it isn't available for sale or lease. And then from this, we can carve out again all those areas that have been legally removed, not just from sale or lease, but really from all economic activities. So these are wilderness areas, protected areas, things like that. So we're both building off of the base map, but we're also carving into it. Finally, add some colors, just showing which governments or agencies are responsible for land management. Red is the US Forest Service, green is Indian reservations, orange is land owned by the state of Arizona, and so forth. Also, we can add some, just a little minor shading here for other kinds of mining leases, solar power concessions, special conservation projects, and so forth. So politically, my goal here was to take this complex set of dozens of agencies and land conservation programs, analyze them, and try to present them in just a few simple, relatively intuitive categories for understanding land management. White areas, gridded areas, areas where all you see is the base map. And the final step is to add the people. To do this, I use thousands of little dots. So if we zoom in here, you can see more or less the same color scheme I used in New York. Again, I'm plotting the data block by block. And in each of the 3 maps, I'm showing a different social landscape. So this area here, which is pretty uniformly white, is actually quite differentiated when we look at income. And it's differentiated in still another way when we look at age. Now, as you probably also know, Phoenix is famous as a city with a lot of retired people. But you can see, by looking at the city as a whole, there's actually some incredible segregation by age. The dark purple areas here, a lot of them are actually legally restricted for only people above a certain age. These aren't government restrictions. These are restrictions by the developers of these privately planned and managed housing communities. Now, the thing I want to emphasize about this map, the reason why I think it in fact is showing this hybrid landscape of natural, social, and legal systems interacting, is that once you put it all together, it's not entirely clear what's the base map and what's the overlay. The base map, in other words, becomes itself a kind of thematic layer, like any other. So we look at this area, for example. A figure and ground become quite ambiguous. There's not a clear sequential logic of what comes first and what comes later, what's important and what's supplementary. You can see little thin gray roads in the white areas. There's these isolated floating chunks of developable land floating in the wilderness. There's this mountain range that's been chopped in half. The thousands of dots that appear underneath the grid, but on top of the gridless areas as well. So the result visually is kind of a collection of partial layers, none of which is primary. And we're forced, I think, to consider the city not as a human overlay onto a pre-existing natural system, but as a really complex structure where human classifications and legal systems create ideas and categories of naturalness at the same time that the topography is also shaping the human presence. So these are the two projects. One is about the city on its own. One is about the city in the desert. One is about a kind of radical simplification of what the map should show. One is about a kind of complex layering. But both are meant to be argumentative and emotionally evocative while still using straightforward, hard data. And both of them are about challenging this idea of a neutral topographic world, the world of the base map. Instead, I want to show the world as socially produced. I want to show space and landscape as constructed through human categories, categories of identity, policy, law, and history. Thanks. And we have a microphone that you can throw, which is, I think,
Have a dice microphone.
It's amazing.
Thank you, Bill, for your wonderful lecture. It was really amazing to learn about your process.
Great.
Are there any questions from the audience for Bill Rankin?
We have plenty of time. I'm happy to take big questions, small questions, nitty-gritty questions.
I want to go to Sarah first, and I'll go to you, Jarrett.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that, and I love your work. I highly
talking into a box.
It is funny. I highly recommend that other people check out Radical Cartography's his website. I have two questions. One might be slightly personal, but I think the students like to hear people's stories. So you have a background in architecture from Rice.
Yeah, that's right.
And it would be really interesting to know your process, how you went from being an architect to a PhD in history focused on mapping.
Yeah. So I started off freshman year of college thinking that I wanted to be an architect. I was in architecture school. My degree at Rice has a kind of a somewhat complex program where you get 2 bachelor's degrees in 6 years. And I also had an engineering component as part of that. And it was great. I learned a lot. I, of course, got deep into questions of design and drawing and representation. Got a lot of the kind of the technical skills of drawing and those kinds of things. Within a couple of years of being an architect out in the world, I decided that what really excited me was kind of some of the higher level concepts and scholarship and that kind of stuff. And that sent me back to do the PhD. When I started the PhD, I actually didn't think that I would be working much on mapping at all. Mapping had started for me as a really personal process of exploration. So I grew up in Chicago. I went to school in Houston, big gridded flat areas. Went to Boston and was totally disoriented and had no idea what was going on. And was making maps as a way of really exploring the city and trying to understand how the city was put together, kind of challenging some of the narratives about the city that I heard from my friends and colleagues. People complaining that Boston was a super white city with not much going on. It's just this one subway line, blah. But it's not true at all. You just have to go to different parts of the city. And so the mapping really started as a way of kind of keeping my kind of design brain activated while in the library for hours and hours doing all the reading. And it was only over many years that I realized, it's still happening actually, that I realized that the mapping stuff was actually something that I could say more about as a scholar as well. So it started as a side project separate from my scholarship, became the focus of my scholarship. And now actually in the last few years, I'm starting to work, especially collaboratively with other scholars, to think about mapping as a strategy within the humanities, as a kind of a method for investigation, trying to bring geographic and spatial analysis into mostly non-spatial disciplines like history, anthropology, things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was wondering what sort of media you would suggest for someone wanting to learn more about maps,
Media meaning what?
whether it be like books or certain websites or just general sources.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that, so my website, actually, there's a section about some books and stuff I recommend. I recommend those books. I think that a lot of it is about getting your hands on the maps. So for as long as I've been making maps, I've also been collecting maps, not spending any money on them, just like on the web. So I have, I don't know, with me today, I have 8,000 maps that I've collected over the years. And I'm constantly organizing them and rearranging them and trying to understand them. Spending a lot of time on everything from kind of rare book dealers' websites, because they scan every map they sell and put it online, to government records collections, to the Library of Congress, and so forth. And collecting huge numbers of maps actually has been the best way for me to understand even what I'm trying to do, right? Seeing what other map makers have done over the last couple hundred years. And I'm collecting them not just as a historian. I'm collecting them also as a way to try to just be exposed to a huge range of ideas. And I found that so much more helpful than, say, tutorials for this or that software and that kind of thing. And I approach a lot of the technicalities of map making really kind of opportunistically. What various tools do I need to cobble together to do this or that project, rather than how do I really understand this tool and then do whatever it's telling me to do. So typical maps like these, especially the Phoenix map, it might be 6 or 7 different software packages, each of which does something well that I'm kind of cobbling together, rather than investing everything into ArcGIS, for example. And other than that, I think that a lot of it is and I was struck. I was having a conversation with the people at National Geographic when I was doing a project for them about how they find map makers and who they hire, basically. And they said they don't tend to hire people who have just purely a background in mapping. They tend to hire people who have an interest in something in the world and have found mapping as a way to get into that thing. That it's much easier to teach people the technicalities of this or that software than it is to teach them the thing that you want to really sink your teeth into, whether it's environmental policy or I don't know, history of exploration, or pick your thing, right? And that kind of investment in a particular subject area, I think, is just as important as the kind of map making in general. Does that help? Yeah, sure. Oh, and also, I guess one other thing on my faculty page. If you go, you can just Google me at Yale. There's what download for a bunch of links I have for where to find maps online. There's huge numbers of maps online now that you can download for free at amazing resolution, and have a list of links there. It's under resources for students.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm a planning student, so I do like some mapping stuff, and I did undergrad in geography too. So you did mention about index of diversity.
Mhm.
So those index numbers, do you have to do a lot of research papers, like read a lot to kind of define how much is how much? Can you explain how do you define index of diversity?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there are, as you probably know, 3 or 4 different measures people have come up with over the years. There's actually a Wikipedia page that kind of goes through all of them. It's not the best Wikipedia page, but it's pretty good. And yeah, I did dig into, I downloaded this or that, these papers to figure out which one is doing what. I think for the maps that you saw here, I ultimately decided that the more intuitive metric would be the one that I wanted to use. So I spent just as much time trying to understand what is the real world implication of this or that number as I did trying to figure out how to calculate it, or the state of the research on that. And the idea of what are the chances of running into someone who's of a different racial or ethnic group than you if you live on this block, that to me has a kind of intuitive quality to it, where some of the other indexes don't have that. So they might be well suited to a particular research need, but are less easy to understand at a glance, right? And then actually calculating it was just a question of I didn't do the math. The computer did the math. But yeah, no, I think that every project that I've done has involved some foray into something like that, right? It's often a sort of like, just Googling around until I find my way into the literature some way. So yeah, and so whether it's actually I just did a project about tree canopy, tree cover in North America, and found my way to, there's a different index of similarity instead of diversity that is used by ecologists and tree specialists and stuff, that's just calculated in a slightly different way. That's better suited to areas with lots and lots of different types of species rather than just a few major groups. So yeah, I think that a lot of it is just, you've got to figure out what's the appropriate metric rather than just clicking the button that says index of diversity.
Yeah, I'm gonna probably like do something like a walkability index for the city or thing. Do you have like any suggestions or like a bicyclability index for a city?
right.
You know, those tiny components.
Yeah.
Yeah, census block. Yeah, I'm not sure how do you tie in into census block into that.
Yeah.
Question for
I
that.
think my suggestion, such as it is, would be, like I was just saying, to go for something which is intuitive to grasp rather than a number that hides a bunch of stuff, right? So there are these, I'm thinking of things like the Human Development Index, HDI, which is a combination of longevity, education, and GDP per capita. And like that's people can understand that, but it's getting a little complex. And there's others that are probably more suitable to certain specialist research projects, but like are way too complex for anyone to actually understand what it's about, right? And something like walkability, a lot of the indexes, you just get a number and you have no idea what this actually means. And at least from where I sit, I would rather have, say, different metrics that I understand better, rather than trying to hide everything behind a single number. Now, the walk score that you probably know, has been very successful. I think because it is one number, right? And it probably has worked better as a single number than it would as a collection of different things. But in terms of mapping, I always have a preference for showing kind of one thing at a time over a series of maps than trying to make the one map that explains everything. Right? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you.
More questions?
And I'm disappointed we're not actually throwing the throwable microphone.
I was just
Can we do
going to
that?
say, let's
Yeah.
try this.
Hey.
This is cool.
Yeah.
So I'm Ali Jabbar. I'm from architecture program, second year. I'm really interested in the graphic style and the graphic components
Yeah.
to use in laying out the plans and elevations and so on. So you use two different graphic styles in both projects of New York and Phoenix. Can you just tell us more about the color picking technique that you used and all like the process of choosing those and laying them out?
Yeah, sure. So first thing, hopefully this is obvious, but I'll say it anyways. I'm not using color metaphors of race, right? Not using skin color as a proxy for the social categories of race and ethnicity. So that was kind of rule number one, right? But that's relatively straightforward. From a design point of view, actually, I think that it gets more complex. And I guess the sort of the shop floor advice I would have here is that the way that color pickers work in Photoshop or Illustrator or any software is actually not how color is perceived, because those color pickers mix up value, which is how light or dark something is, with the color and the saturation, right? So a lot of it is really trying to sort of get a new, different way into the color pickers. And a lot of it's just trial and error until I see something that kind of trusting my own intuition over the numbers. Because let's see, maybe I can even bring this up. Let's see. This should come up. Let's see. Yeah, here we go. So for example, the screen colors that you get, the totally saturated Roy G. Biv rainbow colors, which is a very standard color palette in scientific maps or scientific graphics and journals, stuff like that, have an inherently different lightness according to the eye. So if you have just the standard rainbow spectrum on your map, it's the blue colors that are going to seem the most prominent because the eye responds to that darker color, right? So a lot of the color picking, and some projects of mine, I was like 80% of the project is just picking the colors, right? The data is already there. That's why I'm using it. It's really easy. And it's really about trying to really understand how we're perceiving the patterns based on the colors we're using. And a lot of it is thinking about these kinds of relationships of how the colors, kind of what they signify with different hues, tones, saturations, et cetera, rather than just trying to increase the number of colors we use in order to match colors to an index or something like that. Does that help?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good in throwing.
I'm going to try to throw it. Ready?
Hey!
So I was like the maps are really compelling in looking at seeing things differently in the sense of like the way you were able to show New York as 5 different cities when you presented it through like the perspective of one race or something.
Yeah.
So could you talk more about kind of maybe the implication, the use, or where you see this work kind of going in terms of like its importance and how it impacts people's perception of reality?
Yeah, sure. So that's obviously a big question, but let me throw up another map. So this is the first kind of racial dot map that I made. So I made this map, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago now. And this is the map. You've probably seen things like this elsewhere. So again, lots of little dots instead of solid colors. And this is what I got an email from the New York Times a few months after publishing this. This is what led to their big dot mapping interactive thing for the whole country. So these maps have moved around quite a lot. I first made this in response to an inquiry from a elementary or middle school teacher in the suburbs of Chicago. He was about to teach this book called There Are No Children Here, which is a famous book, especially in Chicago, about growing up in the housing projects. And he was trying to make sure that the students understood some basic patterns of the city before they read the book. And mapping was the way he was trying to do that, and the students weren't quite getting it. Could I help them out by making a better map? So this is what I came up with. And even for me, I grew up in Chicago. I understood the segregation of the city for sure. It was a revelation to see it in this way. Because instead of seeing the city as a kind of patchwork of neighborhoods, each of which was relatively homogeneous and had clearly defined borders, I instead saw the city as this, some borders were incredibly sharp, shockingly sharp. Others were much more blurry. And there's these huge kind of gaps that I'd never really considered before, infrastructure, shipping warehouses, and that kind of stuff. And so then I've heard from him and also other, actually, like I think 3 or 4 teachers in particular have emailed me from Chicago saying how helpful this map has been when understanding segregation in Chicago and the different flavors of segregation, really, that you can see in the city. And how much this kind of gets the students to understand these patterns more than kind of shading the jigsaw puzzle kinds of maps. I know I made maps like this for the Bay Area, for other cities. They've been used by various activist groups, anti-racist groups, things like that. So I think that some of these kind of simple moves can really make a difference in how people understand the city. And if not the city, then other places as well. And really the shift here is from sort of seeing the city as a patchwork of political units or neighborhoods to seeing the city as a collection of people, basically. I think it's as simple as that, to say we should be mapping the people instead of mapping the neighborhoods.
So, as you talked about some of these maps being revelatory, letting you see something you couldn't see. And as we enter into sort of a world of big data, are you concerned about maps becoming weaponized as a way of, for instance, gerrymandering political boundaries or creating situations? So within that context, is there data that we shouldn't collect, and why?
Yeah, well, yes is the easy answer. Well, first I would say maps have been weaponized as long as maps have been around. That's why people have made maps, right? So the very first things that we would consider maps are created by certain states in early modern Europe to wage war and control land and all that kind of stuff, right? Maps have always been instrumental in this way, and the gerrymandering and stuff that's already happening, right? The latest round of censuses goes directly into the computers, and yeah, so that's that's the world we currently live in, not the world that's yet to come. And I think that there's I'm not a believer in collecting all the data you can and then figuring out what to do with it. I think that there always needs to be that the questions of visibility and legibility are as much legal questions, social, cultural questions, as they are just data questions, right? And I think that that's often something that is misunderstood, or even people try to circumvent it. This idea that there's not that there's an inherent tension between legibility and privacy, but that they're the same question, that we should be thinking about what are the limits of privacy when we're thinking about what are the limits of legibility. And I'm not on the side of legibility. I'm on the side of trying to understand the right balance there. How do we make sure that we are making maps that are revelatory and can change the way we think about the world, but that aren't changing our own sense of what the boundaries of the personal should be. So some of the big data projects also, I think this is a slightly different answer to a slightly different question. You get this kind of real-time monitoring, say, of all the taxi cabs in San Francisco, or Instagram photographs around New York City and things like that. It's kind of anonymous data. I think some of the problem there is that we're collecting all this data, but we're not seeing new patterns in it, right? So I think there's a kind of fetishization of some of this big data stuff, collecting huge amounts of data, plotting it just for the sake of plotting it, without sifting it to try to say, okay, how does this actually change the way we understand the city? Rather than, oh, look, you can see all the people taking photographs of, the things we already knew they're taking photographs of. So yeah, I think there absolutely is a conversation about privacy, and some of that also is about, what's permissible for use, by law enforcement and these kind of things. These are ongoing questions for sure. This is especially contentious in areas where there's not very good basic mapping data. So like the World Bank, for example, has sponsored a bunch of projects for mapping informal settlements in Nairobi and Kinshasa and other places. And these are sometimes seen as just absolutely, it's better to have maps than not to have maps, right? Let's definitely put people on the map. But at the same time, these are the maps that then make these formally kind of invisible, self-governing almost neighborhoods suddenly visible to people with bulldozers, right? So I think that sometimes, I think we should see mapping as a double-edged phenomenon, one where the price of visibility is that you're legible to outsiders as well. I see.
So my question is kind of, mapping is used for a lot of different things. Do you think that the data and the maps that you're making, like your New York map, where you've kind of disassociated physical things with temporal things, like are those maps, or have you found a highly useful way to use those maps to draw new connections? Like the fact that it is maybe the processes have been disassociated from the means or the physical aspects of it. Like, can you use those maps to draw new connections or find new data?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. So is it that kind of what do I learn by making the maps in a new way, or?
Like, because sometimes, mapping, you would use it to maybe find new patterns or new explanations for things that maybe previously weren't known.
Yeah.
Do these maps lend to that, being so maybe disassociated from the kind of physical world that they exist in?
Right. Well, I think actually they make it, for me, easier to see those new patterns, right? They force me to get rid of my preconceived ideas of where things ought to be. So if I can look at the New York maps, here they are. So for this is the Asian Americans. I had in mind Chinatown, right? But of course, there's this huge area in Queens here, mostly South Asian, which I hadn't thought about, basically, in my kind of mental landscape of Asian Americans in greater New York City. Then there's other concentrations down here in Brooklyn, over New Jersey. So I think that absolutely you're almost forced to see things that were not part of your kind of conceptual map beforehand, right? And so I see this, with every project, not just this one. A big part of it is actually sort of saying, okay, let's pretend I know nothing about this. What do I actually see here, right? And then the trick, I think, is to, and I think this is kind of what I was saying in response to the earlier question about using the big data to actually find new insights. I think that the crucial step is actually to say, okay, let's pretend that I don't know what's going on here. What do I actually see? And how does that then compare to the things that I thought I knew before, right? And that process of comparing what we're learning from these new patterns with what we thought we knew before is, I think, really a crucial one. Yeah.
I'll ask the last question. So at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how maps are not neutral, how there's an inherent bias in them. As a map maker, how would you define your bias?
Oh, yeah. First thing, I wouldn't say that bias is a bad thing. Bias is an inevitable thing, right? Yeah. If we use bias as a bad word, that suggests that there's a possibility of making an unbiased map, which is totally not possible, right? All maps have a point of view. All maps are a view from somewhere. So where is my bias, or what is my point of view? I think a lot of my point of view is trying to understand. Well, I guess there's a few things that I've kind of focused on as themes in my work, let's say. One is trying to understand boundaries, so not taking boundaries for granted. Trying to understand what's the difference between a boundary that is like a physical separation, a stark social separation, so some of those bright lines on the Chicago map, versus a boundary that's just an artifact of the way the data was collected, right? And trying to find different representational techniques for telling some of those kinds of boundaries apart. And there's definitely a politics to that, right? Not taking existing boundaries for granted, I think, is about trying to to see populations that would otherwise be invisible, trying to see especially minority populations not to get averaged out into overall aggregates, things like that. Those aren't directly political in terms of who to vote for, but they're political in terms of what's made visible and what is worth bringing to the table. Yeah. So that's a big one, kind of boundaries, transitions, spatial transitions. I think another one. Another one might just be, let's say, seeing space as historical might be another bias that I bring. Not in these projects, but other projects, I've really tried to think about what are new techniques for thinking about showing change over time spatially. What are all the various ways that maps can and do show time in a really sophisticated ways, right? It's not true that maps are totally non-temporal medium, right? And seeing the present-day patterns as rooted in historical processes, that's a preference that I have. That's something that I try to do in my work. We can call it a bias. I think the politics there would be to try to say, yeah, like the problems we face or the issues that we're dealing with here have to be understood in this much broader context, have to be understood as perhaps more intractable than we thought, less easy to turn 90 degrees just because we want to, that kind of stuff. So those would maybe two. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
And let's thank Bill again.
Great. Thank you.